Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, listeners. It is a lovely day here in suburban Chicago. Well, I say lovely. It's not actually lovely. It's late April, and the temperature is in the high 30s, and it's cloudy. So when I said lovely, I guess I was lying by every stretch of that word. So not good. Nonetheless, sorry, I had to wait for some traffic there. Nonetheless, I'm happy to talk with you as I walk by these lovely tulips that my neighbors have planted and listen to the birds tweet. Because it's April, this is often the time when I return to books about the Titanic. I've mentioned a number of times on this podcast that I'm a bit of a Titaniac, as they say. No one says that except me and my friend Megan Norsha. But I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about some games that you could make built around the idea of the Titanic. Now, as a side note, I have 5 books. I have 4 games about the Titanic already. I have SOS Titanic from Bruno Cathala, generally thought of as the most interesting or best Titanic game. This is a sort of variant of Klondike Solitaire in which you are trying to arrange the passengers from the Titanic in lifeboats so that you can rescue as many of them as you can. Of course, being in the Regency era, or being in the era of the Titanic, you have to respect their status as passengers, so you can't put steerage passengers in with first class passengers. That part's pretty stupid, but does actually kind of fit what happened on the ship. It's an interesting game. You can play it solo, you can play a 2-player. I think it actually plays up to 4, but I've never played with more than 2. It's a fun game, pretty interesting, well made, and it's got a fantastic board in which the ship sinks over the course of time. The board is a spiral bound booklet, and on the first page the ship has just hit the iceberg and it's stopped, and then as you go along you turn the pages and the ship slowly sinks further and further, and then you have to get as many people off the ship as you can before the ship sinks. Like I said, a really good game. You can go listen to my episode about it. I will have a link in the show notes. Things go downhill quickly from here, although this is all speculation because that's the only one of my Titanic games I've played, I am ashamed to say. Of the 4 Titanic themed games that I have, the only one I've played is SOS Titanic. I will say SOS Titanic has been republished in what looks like a lovely new edition from, unfortunately, the Gaming Goat publishers, which I know the owner of the local Gaming Goat stores, and he's a nice guy. But the chain is problematic. You can read up about it if you like. The owner of the whole chain says and does nasty things regularly. You can go read about that if you like. But so if you wanted to get SOS Titanic right now, that's how you would have to buy it, is through that channel. Or you could, buy a used copy for $50 that's in German, which is what I did. Anyway, so the other 3 games I'm just going to run through really quick in order of interesting. Oh, wait, I have 4. I have 4 more games. So I guess I have 5 games total. The next one is probably likely the worst, and this is a game just called Titanic. It was published in the late 90s to capitalize on the popularity of the film, although it is not actually branded with the film. It's a pretty weird little roll and move game in which you're supposed to run to your cabin and get your things and then run to a lifeboat and get off the ship. You are a first class passenger. I haven't played it, but it looks pretty bad. Also, the components are not very nice. Then I have 2 more classic or novelty games, are the games that I have because they're older. We have The Sinking of the Titanic, which was later republished with a different name because people thought it was in poor taste. And it was published in the 70s, which means that there were still people alive who had been on the Titanic and could actively remember it, as opposed to, I don't think anyone else is still alive from the Titanic. There might be a couple of the infants who are still alive, but no, I don't think so. I think at this point all the Titanic survivors have died because they'd be 110 years old at this point. So this one was published in the 70s. You have this boat that tilts as you play, and then eventually it you sink, and then there's a sequence where you're paddling around in lifeboats or something. I looked through the rules when I first got it, and it looked weird and wonderful in a kitschy way, but I haven't had a chance to play it yet. That's the sinking of the Titanic. And then I have two more. I have Raise the Titanic, which is a game based on the Clive Cussler novel and the movie that they made from the novel that was written in the early 80s, and it's about the finding of the wreck of the Titanic and raising it. It was written before the Titanic was actually found, when they discovered that, yes, the eyewitnesses were correct. The ship had broken in half, which is something the engineers at Harlan and Wolff insisted could not have happened, but it surely did. And but since this one was made before it, it involves the ship complete and, supposedly going to be raised from the ocean floor. The game comes with a big plastic Titanic that you get to lift up, which is hilarious. And then finally, there was recently a recently made new game called Titanic that is themed around the film, and you play Jack or Rose or Cal or Rose's mother, and you're running around, I think, saving people, trying to get people onto lifeboats, which doesn't fit the theme of the game at all, or the theme of the movie at all. But it's themed heavily around the movie and has lots of little bits and pieces from the movie that are fun, supposedly. I haven't tried that one either. I picked it up just because it sounded like a hoot, and I collect Titanic-themed games. So that's the 5 games I already have that are Titanic-themed. I also have one more coming, an abstract puzzle game called Deck Chairs on the Titanic. It is like I said, an abstract puzzle game where you are one of the people who works to arrange the chairs on the Titanic, and you're trying to get the most tips from your clients by getting them the best spots on the deck. And as was often told in stories, shortly after the first collision, but before the ship had properly started sinking, there were some men kicking around a big piece of ice like a football, and so the piece of ice is part of the game. Not super heavily Titanic themed, but interestingly enough. All right, so those are the games I already have, but I was thinking about doing a Themestorm for you today of what would, if someone came to me and said, Brendan, we want you to design a Titanic themed game, what would you design? And I thought of 3 different versions, and I thought it might be interesting to think about what would be a good accompanying reading or text about that particular practice. So to start with, I haven't seen anything yet, with the exception of the fictional Raise the Titanic, about the exploration of the wreck. There's a lot of super interesting stuff happening that has happened with the wreck. Since the early 2000s, it has slowly and more been damaged by its time in the sea. And one of the books that I read said that there was like a sort of large wave of dunes moving slowly toward it. So they thought it was going to be covered up, not in the not too distant future, by the ocean floor. I'm not sure how true that is, but it could be. So what would a game about exploring the wreck be? On the one hand, you could have a deduction game or a hunt and peck game about trying to find the wreck, sort of mimicking the experience of Bob Ballard with the American team and then the French team, who were kind of racing to find the wreck. They were ostensibly working together, but each team wanted to be the one who found it. The economic systems management kind of exploration thing could be, could have part of the game. It could be sort of set up like on Mars, where part of the game involves what you're doing on the sea floor. You can have different kinds of exploration goals. There's historiography, there's engineering, and there's biology, all 3 of which are part of what people are and were doing with the Titanic wreck. The historiography, obviously, they're documenting what's found on the bottom, learning more about the people who are on the ship and what happened to them. The engineering is looking at both what happened to the ship while it was on the surface, but also what happened to the wreck after it hit the ground or hit the floor of the ocean. And then the biology part, there's been a variety of different interesting developments from a perspective of biology with regard to the wreck. If you've seen the James Cameron movie, the wreck is covered with these like weird, what look like stalactites from a cave. They end up calling them rusticles. And these are actually colonies of anaerobic bacteria that feed on the different kinds of metal that the ship is made of. And the structures of those colonies and the kinds of creatures they are so different than anything else we've seen that there was some really interesting biology to do. So perhaps you have, on one hand, different kinds of goals you're trying to accomplish with these different levels, and different players could have different motivations based on their lead team about which things they're going to find most valuable and would earn them the most points. But then you also have the management of the resources, and perhaps there's some shared resources that everybody has to manage together. And yeah, it seems like an economic management thing about exploring the wreck would be pretty interesting. Now, as for books, I would say like the book I'm reading right now, Farewell Titanic, or they also have Titanic, Her Name, and Ghosts of the Titanic. All three of these are books by Charles Pellegrino, and he's writing a lot about exploring the wreck and what they're doing with the wreck. So that would be the accompanying text, I would say, for that economic management game. Another option would be running the shipbuilding company Harlan and Wolff as you build the Titanic. What probably the way this game would work would be it'd be similar, not at all the same, but similar in theme and shape of theme to Vladimir Suchi's shipyard, where each player has a different yard and you're building this massive ship. Maybe you're competing for world's largest ship, or you all have similar goals, and there could be a variety of managing the ore that's coming in, managing the workforce, dealing with design challenges based on blueprints and engineers available, right? The same kinds of economic concerns that come up in a Vladimir Suchi game. You could do that specifically aimed at building the Titanic and her sister ships. I think the accompanying text that I would watch there would be, I can't remember what it's, Titanic Blood and Iron or something like that. It's the mini-series that they made that explores the building of the Titanic and the labor issues that went into building it. You have this group of steerage or workers, you have the engineer class, you have the wealthy management class, and the variety of workers from these different groups that are how they're mingling and how religion shaped what was going on in Belfast at the time and so on. So it feels like that you could build a lot of theme in based around Harlan and Wolff, and you could make up a couple other similar shipbuilding companies for your game. If you check the show notes, I will find out the actual name of that mini-series that I was talking about. I don't think it's Blood and Iron, but it's something close to that. I'm pretty sure Blood is in the title. But so that's the accompanying text. And then finally, the third game that I think would be interesting to make regarding the Titanic is somewhat inspired thematically by deck chairs on the Titanic, but also by Grand Austria Hotel. And this would be a game about managing the shipboard experience before and during the journey. That you would be like the head of staff for the competing ships, or perhaps you are head of staff of one of the 4 departments on the Titanic, and you are doing your best to earn points by making sure that the different passenger groups have fantastic experiences on the ship. By itself, that sounds like bog standard, the same as every other Titanic or every other sort of game of that type, right? How is that different than Grand Austria Hotel? Well, the difference would have to come in what happens after the sinking, that perhaps part of what you have to do is try to save as large a percentage of your people as you can on the lifeboats. Now, this would get pretty cutthroat and kind of dark, so I'm not sure this would actually work as a good game. It might just be sticking to the first half. Managing the Ship of Dreams would be interesting and productive or fun to play. But it seems to me like a game that if you could figure out a way to make the second half of the game, or the last round, maybe the last round is while the ship is sinking, and your priorities shift for that last round. I don't know what that would be or how that would work. It's sort of a fascinating complexity that, I just don't know how you'd resolve that. But it would be really interesting to see that emerge. So that is my idea for another Titanic game. Unfortunately, I don't have a good analog for that, except I would say one of the hotel movies, like your Grand Budapest Hotel, or Grand Hotel is another good one. That might be a good one to do. Or you could watch like the 1952 Titanic starring Clifton Webb. That one would be interesting because it does have a lot of the depictions of the first class life aboard the ship. So those are my ideas for 3 different Titanic themed games that I think do something different than the other games that are on the market right now. Says the guy who owns 5 Titanic games and has only played one of them. That's a sad state of affairs that I need to fix sometime soon. So my question for you, dear listener, is what would you do to make a Titanic themed game? Or what other themes do you think we should explore as a Themestorm here on Pick Up and Deliver? I would love to hear your answers, and the best place to hear them, or read them rather, is on Board Game Geek in Guild 3269, where we keep a conversation space for listeners to this podcast. I would love to have you join us over there and tell us what themes you think we should be exploring, or I should be exploring on my walks. Well, I'm home now and the weather is chilly, so I'm going to call it a day. Thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.